Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual event. My name is Tiff Macklem, and I have the great pleasure of being the Dean of the Rotman School of Management. This is the third in what has become a weekly webinar series, Managing Uncertainty, Coping with and Adapting to COVID-19. Our goal is to bring together evidence-based perspectives, tapping into the Rotman Brain Trust to bring perspectives on how to cope, how to manage, and how to lead through the tremendous uncertainty that this COVID-19 crisis has created in all our home and work lives. This week, we have a topic that is increasingly, I think, on all our minds, and that is reopening the economy. How do organizations prepare for the new normal? You don't need an economist to tell you that we're in a recession. Just walk down your favorite commercial street. Restaurants and bars, stores are all closed. Live entertainment, sporting events, international travel have all been suspended. Indeed, we've had to shut down large parts of the economy to restrain the spread of the virus. And we are going to experience, as a result, the sharpest plunge in economic activity that we have experienced in our lifetime. Our leaders tell us we're still weeks away from lifting those restrictions and reopening the economy. Now's the time to really be planning for how we're going to do that. When those restrictions are lifted, it's not going to be a sudden return to normal. The virus is going to be with us till we get a vaccine, and that's probably more than a year away. The key to recovering, the key to ramping activity back up is going to be to figure out how do we restart the economy without respreading the triggering a respread of the virus. I expect that in many of your organizations, you're beginning to think about what does that back to work plan look like? How are we going to serve customers in this new normal? What are the behavioral and emotional needs of our employees and our customers? What are our responsibilities as a company? How can we nudge our employees to come to work in a way that is not going to respread the virus? And what are the shifts in consumer demand that perhaps we can capitalize on? Companies that can respond to these shifts are obviously going to do better have better results than ones that can't. There are lots of questions. Unfortunately, we have two of Rotman's finest strategic management professors to engage with me in a discussion on these important topics. So I know we really want to hear from them, so let me quickly introduce them and then we will get into the questions. First, we have Professor Anita McGahan. Anita is a University Professor of Strategic Management and the George E. Connell Chair of Organizations and Society at the Rotman School of Management and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Anita's research is focused on industry change, sustainable competitive advantage, and the emergence of new fields. An area of particular interest for Anita is global public health, which couldn't be more relevant today. Joining Anita is Professor Nicola Lacetera. He's an associate professor of strategic management at the Rotman School and the University of Toronto at Mississauga. He's an applied economist with a wide range of research and teaching interests, including motivations for altruistic behavior, ethics in markets, health economics, strategic management, and industrial organization and innovation in economics and society. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask Anita and Nicola some questions. And while I'm doing that, those of you on Zoom, you should be thinking about your questions. So if I don't answer them, send them to us. You can use the Q&A button on your screen, and I'm going to make sure I get as many of your questions to Anita and Nicola as well. So with that, let's get started. And Anita, I'm going to start with you. perhaps you could just start with giving us some practical insights in what should we be thinking about as we plan to get back to work.
Well, thanks so much, Tiff, and welcome to the community, and very best wishes to everyone. I wanted especially to acknowledge the suffering of those who may have lost loved ones or who have been ill. We're thinking of you, and it's great to have everyone together. So I wanted to offer a three-part framework with some ideas about, how practically we could think about reopening the implications of reopening the economy for businesses. So the first set of ideas that I wanted to develop and put on the table has to do with how the reopening of the economy will affect the way we work in almost a physical sense. Now, social distancing guidelines obviously are going to be in place for a while, even in workplaces, and that's going to affect the layout of many organizations, including not just retail, but also manufacturing organizations, any organization where people have to be together. Pragmatic questions such as where are your workers going to wash their hands as frequently as will be necessary in this environment. So there are a whole series of practical questions that most of my friends and colleagues who are running organizations have started to think about, which is terrific. Some of the more sort of behind the scenes questions that also reflect things like how are we going to manage reporting relationships when the people who are able to come to work first are going to be those that have immunity and may, just because of the demographics of the population and the nature of this disease, be relatively, let's say, younger, all else equal, interacting with supervisors who are still at home and working through Zoom. So how is that going to work? How is that going to play out in an organization? There may also be questions of people having to leave really relatively quickly because they're either exposed and have to be in self-quarantine or because they have to take care of loved ones who are. So there's this sort of tension between how do we share work together to make sure that we can support colleagues who may have to leave the environment quickly versus how do we social distance at work and stay apart from each other so as to not have a particular workplace become a hotspot of infection. So there are a whole number of practical questions about the way people are going to have to interact at work that go one step beyond just putting tape down on the floor to keep people 6 feet apart from each other that have to be addressed and that we can begin to plan for. The second set of points that I wanted just to put on the table have to do with what I'm calling this hangover of fear and suffering and pain that people will be experiencing both as employees and as consumers and throughout a company's stakeholder groups here. So, how do you deal with the fact that when workers come back, they may be afraid to be at work, that they may have enormous pressures that have to do with job loss in the home or in the community that are pulling them in different directions, that are distracting. If they've been ill, they may still be frail. If they have loved ones who are ill, their minds may not be at work. So how are we going to deal with those kinds of questions? Tiff already mentioned a tremendous change in consumer demand and consumer behavior. I don't know if you feel this way, Nico and Tiff, but in my family, what we're talking about is why did we go to restaurants so frequently in the first place anyway? Do we really want to be spending our money that way? How are we going to, budget more responsibly? What have we learned? My partner just the other day gave me a haircut. Do we want to keep doing that? Like, what is it that we're spending our money on? How do we want to think about our budget? And those kinds of questions are going to really, I think, have a pervasive impact on consumer demand. And I'm really excited to hear what Nico thinks about that, since I know that that's your area of interest. We have to anticipate a change in productivity and a change in consumer behavior. And trying to think about that and use analytics to think about that and to be sensitive about that is an important opportunity. And then the third piece, which I wanted to mention briefly, has to do with innovation. Tiff already mentioned that there's tremendous sectoral differences here, and I'd love to talk about that if that's of interest. But really, some core questions are, what about the innovation agenda in any organization has not changed? What has changed about the innovation agenda? In other words, how do we have to innovate at innovating, in order to be effective coming out of this experience here? You know, just to give an example of that, in our own industry of education, we had been planning through a long process of trying to adapt to educational opportunities online. And then in a weekend, we had to implement. What have we learned? How do we want to be better at what we do as a result of this experience? So those are just some ideas that I wanted to offer as a place to start.
Okay, well, thank you. I must say your partner is much braver than I am. I really worry that if I cut my partner's hair, it might not be good for our long-term relationship. Nico, I know you've been doing some research on quarantines, and I think we're all feeling like these quarantines, they keep getting extended, and obviously there are real risks to ending them too soon. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what does your research suggest? How should we be approaching this? How should we be planning to reopen the economy, but making sure that we don't do it too quickly?
So first of all, let me thank you for having me here, and let me share Anita's wishes and closeness and sympathy to all those affected. Let me also say that I've been doing my hair for like 20 years because of easy job in this sense, so that is easy on my end. Speaking about my research, yeah, we've tried. So the lockdown, the social isolation that we all are going through in Canada, almost everywhere else, although in different ways, is really something that we're not used to, at least for two reasons. One is, we're social animal. We like spending time together. We like seeing other people, other places, especially when the spring comes. And yet we need to stay home. So there is a fatigue, a cost in itself. In addition to that, going outside, seeing people is a form of freedom of movement, freedom of mobility that in a democratic society we hold very dear, among sort of the foundation. We want to move. Freedom of enterprise, as Anita was mentioning, you go around, and Tiff was saying that too, and everything is closed, or almost everything. So this is something very deep that we are experiencing, and it's also hard to make sense of. So in this environment, how do you get people to stay home on the one hand, and how do you plan to open up again, become crucial question, not only for the economy, but really for keeping the sort of social fabric and the social contract that we have all together. And this is the sort of deeper reason that led us to look a little bit of how the expectations that people hold and how they're managed by public authorities in particular might affect compliance and sort of a sense of common purpose in respecting social isolation. So we did this study with a survey of Italian respondents. Italy, which is my country of origin, was, as you all know, I think hardly hit and very early by the pandemics. And so these measures started relatively early, at the very beginning of March. And so we wanted to see what they were expecting it would be happening, what were their thoughts about how long this would last, and to what extent a mismatch between their thoughts, their beliefs, and actual duration of isolation might affect their willingness to comply. So we ran the first wave of the survey toward mid-March. So we were on the sort of steep part of the slope in terms of contagion of diseased people and so on. And what we found is that there was a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of difference in what people were thinking about the duration of self-isolation. Some people thought it would be only a few weeks. Some people thought it would be a few months, or even indefinite amount of time until needed, which might mean that people are more or less optimistic, but also our sense is that communication hasn't been as clear. So the first thing we pointed is it's very important to be coherent and consistent and to give a clear message, be it's going to be 2 weeks, be it's going to be months, but at least we all are on the same page about what is supposed to happen. And when we ask people to consider scenarios of different durations of the self-isolation, what we found is that if that scenario had a much longer duration than they were expecting, then their attitudes toward complying with several self-isolation norms and provisions was much more negative. So a negative surprise was received negatively by people in terms of them saying that they would consider reducing their self-isolation compliance or even transgressing the law altogether. We actually ran a second wave at the peak or plateau. And interestingly enough, now most people were expecting things to end very soon, in just a matter of a few weeks. It was the beginning of April. And so there was a lot in our scenario analysis, a lot of mismatch when we asked people to consider longer duration. And again, we found this negative effect, this willingness of people not to comply if the duration would be longer. What this tells us is, on the one hand, one implication is don't give, strict deadline, keep things vague and give a sense that we still don't know. But on the other hand, we did this at a given point in time. So the question is, how long can we go on just saying we don't know until people really feel overwhelmed, feel that this isn't fair anymore? Also because for many, there are serious economic consequences of staying home. Not everybody can work from home. Not everybody has a stable job, and so on. So there is a very delicate trade-off here between not setting expectations too high, but also give people a sense that things are going to change. Okay, so the solution is probably not to set very close goalposts and then keeping moving them every 2 weeks, but trying to give to be clear, to give clarity, to be honest, to be open about it. Yesterday, there was this viral video by Chancellor Angela Merkel, you might have seen it, in which she was explaining how important it is to have that R0, so the rate of contagion, to be below 1, so that on average, one person infects less than another person. And he explained it beautifully in 1.5 minutes. But what is really relevant is that she gave a sense of how important, how different 1.1 is from 0.95. So that's the kind of thing that is hard to deliver, but it's so important to do it because immediately people can envision it and have a sense that, we are treated fairly. We are not, there is nothing hidden. The information is out there, and you can do it in many different styles. I think another politician who's very open right now is Governor Cuomo in the state of New York. Very different style from Angela Merkel, but this sense of openness, of clarity, and of coherence and consistency among messages at the local or federal level, I think might really help people understanding what's going on and hold on, but at the same time put some pressure on authorities to move on. We need to have the perception that actually something is happening while we're waiting, that someone is working for the transition. Transition is going to be quite long, in my opinion, but I think seeing that we are working to make it happen rather than waiting for it to happen is going to make a big difference, especially again in democratic societies where we expect to have a voice, and we don't expect the police at our door telling us, with a gun to stay inside.
So, my sense is that our leaders in Canada have learned something from the Italian experience, and you can see that they're really not. They're trying to avoid giving a timeline that's too short. So, the message is it's going to be more, several more weeks, which I think is, certainly one of the things you hear about the Italian experience. It's like it was always 2 more weeks, 2 more weeks, 2 more weeks, and that people got really fed up with that. I guess the message for companies again is, don't kind of sugarcoat it. Give a sense of, yeah, this could last a long time, and be as clear and cohesive as you can. So now I want to shift a little bit to ingenuity. I think one of the things, certainly as Dean of Rotman, I've been tremendously impressed with is the ingenuity of the faculty and the staff to, over the course of a few days, take everything we do and figure out how to do it online, figure out how to connect with people, how to serve students, how to deliver education. We're going to need just as much, if not more, ingenuity and innovation if we're going to be able to get back to work effectively, ramp back up economic activity without restarting the spread of the virus. Anita, I'll start with you. Maybe you could say a few words about, where are some areas we need innovation? What should companies be thinking about? Where are we going to need some ingenious solutions?
So thanks so much, and thanks for this question. And I noticed in the Q&A there's questions along the lines that you've just asked, Tiff. So let me just offer a couple of ideas. So, we're under a period of tremendous uncertainty. I don't think that we have comprehensive information quite yet about how the reopening will happen exactly, but we do know that it'll involve extensive testing, contact tracing, and individual quarantine of people who have been exposed and people who are sick. There is an unquestionable, in the midst of all this uncertainty, especially about timing, there are some things that are certain. And one of them is that in industries like retail and air transportation and sporting, that there will not be an early reopening. Tiff, you and I were talking the other day about how in our own business of education, it's not going to make sense to have students mixing in classes in the same way as they were back in January. We're going to have to rethink that. So in sporting, it's almost unquestionably clear that for the next year, until we have herd immunity of some kind, either through vaccines or through some other mechanism, that it's not going to make sense to have us all in stadiums. And so the innovation agenda in these industries, cruise lines, air transportation, sporting, retail, some kinds of retail especially, I think leaders can move forward aggressively to implement innovations that reflect this new reality, and they can do it right now. And we're seeing some of that. For example, this conversation in baseball in the United States about running the games in Arizona and trying to do that safely. We see in cruise lines companies talking about making these cruise ships into floating hospitals and contributing to the remediation there. There's a second sort of middle kind of category where there's a different kind of uncertainty, a different kind of ingenuity that's going to be needed. I'm thinking here about industries that have been highly engaged with dealing with the pandemic, healthcare, financial services, even government, supply chains, where we know that both the old core and a new innovation agenda have to be integrated quickly. And so by contrast to, for example, cruise lines, we know that cruise lines are not going to be redeployed and reopened quickly, just as sporting isn't anytime soon. There, the question is, how do you redeploy those assets in ways that are constructive and value creating? In this the second category that I'm thinking about in healthcare, we have to think about how do we relieve these workers who have been exhausted by the first 8 weeks of this pandemic. How do we get the PPE and ventilators that people need on a timetable that makes sense? How do we remediate the gaps in the global supply chain that have led to these tragic shortages? In financial services, how do we think about risk appropriately? How do we, as let's say a large retail bank, overcome the silos that work so well in the old environment? Just think about how do we redeploy capital effectively and manage exposure to risk. In government, how do we have this kind of multi-level collaboration that has been so characteristic of the Canadian response, but so, if I could be as bold as to say this, as uncharacteristic of the American response, which is where I'm from originally. And then there's a third sector, which is energy, telecommunications, agriculture, entertainment, computing, internet, where there's been really a large shock to the way that we interact with the services of these different industries, and that is going to have consequences for capacity building and so on. And in some of these instances, I think the deployment of AI technologies, the innovation agenda is not qualitatively different in every aspect than it was back in January, but the imperative for actually implementing is much greater.
Yeah, there are some, if you go back to 9/11, the immediate aftermath of 9/11, a whole bunch of extra security brought in airports, and the immediate impact was, chaos, massive security lineups, huge delays. We were all missing flights. It is actually quite incredible how quickly airports were redesigned, new security protocols were developed, and we were able to get through airports with a much higher standard of security than we had before. So, that's just a little microcosm, but we've seen examples where industries have relatively rapidly adapted to a new reality. Nico, do you want to add anything on innovation? I think one thing I know you've been thinking about is social tracing or tracking. Some of the countries that have been really successful in flattening the curve and starting to get back to work are using social tracking mechanisms that would violate privacy laws here in North America. Should we be thinking about some sort of War Measures Act where we temporarily suspend privacy, or would that just be a disaster? Any thoughts on that or other elements of the innovation agenda?
Yeah, so when it comes to privacy, I think the dilemma is pretty serious and hard to solve, especially for two reasons that I think are at the core of the debate about privacy in the digital era more generally, and that they apply to this particular case. One is that sometimes there is no full transparency of who is seeing this data, what they can do with this data that they collect, and so on. And when it comes to data related to health, you can imagine the many consequences this might have in terms of employment opportunities, insurance, you name it. So there is this issue. The second issue you were mentioning, should we suspend privacy or privacy law, or revisit in a speedy form? The question there is that this might represent a precedent. That's my main concern, actually. So this might be a good, a worthy case for it, at least for a while. But what if 3 years from now, 5 years from now, someone comes and say, hey, this is another case like that. We already did it. I feel empowered to do it again, but it is not actually as severe and as justified as it is now. So it's something to be quite careful about. Also, and going back to companies and innovation, it's not only the public authorities who are probably thinking about tracing and so on, but of course, because we want to keep social distancing and we want to take care of these issues also within companies. Companies at the end are not only economic organizations, they're social organizations. People live and work for a good part of their lives. Inevitably, some form of tracings, it will be something that these companies will consider, both directly for their own employees, but also they will be more and more agents of the government, especially those companies that work in this sector. And so a new type of partnership might need to be considered such that citizens, the population, feel that still basic principles are respected. So these are some of the challenges to consider. And more generally, another sector, Anita was mentioning the health sector in terms of how to deal with all these workers and their exhaustion. but even the organization of hospitals need to change profoundly. I mean, one of the issues in these pandemics was the contagion within hospitals, inside hospitals. It's always the case, or other form of health, retirement communities and so on, long-term care communities. Reconsidering the layout of hospitals, a number of procedures and so on is definitely important, just like in many other companies. In a sense, I see companies becoming a little bit more than they are now regulators in a sense of individual behavior. So having a little bit more authority also on certain behaviors and try to address them, especially in terms of personal hygiene, washing hands or shaking hands, and things like that. And so there is a new role to be considered for organizations, and find a way to do it in a way that keeps individual freedom, but nudges, in a sense, employers or others toward sanitizing their hands, washing their hands, and so on and so forth. Having, for example, checklists and protocols is something that companies can consider. On the other hand, of course, too much rigidity might lead to a lack of flexibility in case, for example, an outbreak occurs again. And so these are all issues that, in terms of organizational innovation, that companies should consider.
Well, I'm going to come back on the issue of nudges in a few minutes, but there's no question that companies and the HR people at companies are having to face a whole realm of new issues. And one of the things you saw early on was companies would ban or severely limit international travel for their employees. And then the next question is, could they limit the vacations of their employees? Was that appropriate? Could they limit the travel of other members of their employees' families? And what could they impose on employees if other members of their families? So these were a whole new set of questions that had not been considered. And I think as we get back to work, there are going to be a whole new set of questions. What is it appropriate? What sort of legally can employers require of their employees? And I'll start with you, Anita. You've done some work on this. We've already talked about the fact that the impact of this crisis is going to differ considerably across sectors. If you're in the grocery sector right now, you're probably very busy. Obviously, the health sector, you're worried about a huge surge. Other sectors, international travel, live entertainment, things that involve a lot of people together, cruise ships, they're probably going to take a lot longer to come back. But there's also another dimension, is that this impacts people differently. Some people are disproportionately bearing the brunt of this. Other people are still working. They're still getting incomes. The health, obviously people with preconditions are much more vulnerable from a health perspective. Anita, perhaps you could say something about what are the implications for inequality? How do we manage those? What should companies be thinking about in terms of dealing with the unequal impacts on employees in their companies?
Yeah, thank you. Here I am, sitting behind a screen, socially isolating, still getting paid by the Rotman School, and incredibly privileged as a result of that. This crisis is making people not like me, people who are vulnerable, more vulnerable, a lot more vulnerable. Their lives are at stake in many cases. Their whole financial future has been completely shattered. So there's no question but that this crisis is amplifying vulnerabilities and inequalities. When I go to the grocery store or go to the pharmacy, or, these essential errands that we all have to do, I see the same people there every time that are working 12-hour shifts, that are being exposed to the entire community. Go to the post office, being exposed to the entire community, often saying things to me like, Prof, am I right? I'm pretty sure I'm not going to get this, right? Because I'm young. I'm 35 years old. Tell me what you think, And And it's incredibly tragic to experience this and not know what to do about it. The people who have been laid off are generally people who are contract workers, people who are at least specialized skills and talents. The amplification of vulnerability has just been profound, and it's something that links into this links into something that Nico said that I just wanted to briefly touch on, which is that privacy is very much something that's the province of the privileged. You know, you don't get privacy when you have to live in insecure housing, when you're living in a favela, when you're living in some arrangement where you're living with a lot of people or something like that, you know, where you're packing a lot of people into an apartment, for example, as we see with many immigrants and refugees in Canada. So really thinking about what privacy is and what it means and deconstructing privacy into something more nuanced, I think is going to be very, very important. This crisis is going to lead us to, I think, a very profound conversation about what we value as a society. And we have a great start on that. The Sustainable Development Goals do provide a framework for thinking about what we value, but there are trade-offs between different elements of the Sustainable Development Goals that are being amplified by this crisis that everybody, including especially company leaders and companies, are going to have to deal with in the coming months and years.
Thank you. Okay, Nico, I want to come back to you now on this issue of nudges. And it relates to what we were talking about. Companies are going to be requiring new things of their employees. They're going to be trying to influence their employees' behavior. You know, one way to do it is to make a whole lot of rules. But another way would be to try to use a bit of behavioral thinking. How do we nudge people? How do we influence the way people behave? Any practical advice for companies as they think about using sort of behavioral insights to try to keep people to social distance and wash their hands, be respectful of others?
So, you know, many of the behavioral tendencies of biases we know about and study get amplified in a situation like this. We tend to just look at the evidence that is consistent with our beliefs, and so we might disregard certain information that is useful. We are procrastinators, even for the small things. You know, we need to wash our hands, we need to sanitize. We say we do it in 5 minutes and then we don't do it. So even in the small things, but also organizations need to deal with how to rethink their behavior. This is a case where organizations, companies might be required to change quickly to adapt to the situation. And very often it's hard for organizations, for companies to do it. There is what we call escalation of commitment. Giving up what we have done so far seems much more costly than it should be considered, given the future value that it might give or the negative value it might give. And definitely there is a more sort of rule-based approach to have, for example, employees following certain rules, but there are also sort of more gentle ways, and I see the combination of the two making a lot of sense. Again, making it easy to see where hand sanitizing stations are, where you can wash your hands. Other things may be a little more structural. You know, for a long time we've been praising the open office concept. In a sense, we might, you know, need to reconsider that at least to some extent. So that's something I've been thinking about a little bit. And so also reminders about certain practices, having certain breaks during the workday, in which, you know, people are somewhat incentivized to clean their hands, to keep at a distance, and so on. Definitely incentivizing working from home. So perhaps this might require providing certain equipment to work from home, facilitating that to the extent possible. And this might lead people, while keeping their own freedom to perhaps going to the office, to prefer to stay home a little more. I think another sort of behavioral tendency that sometimes we neglect in these circumstances, and this goes back to a point Anita made just a couple of minutes ago, is how much workers in an organization care about fairness and equality of treatment. Okay, that's one of the reasons why salaries are often, for example, more compressed than differences in productivity would command, because there is a value in equity and fairness. So showing a similar treatment for example, independent workers versus employees doing sometimes very similar things. This could be costly for an organization, but it would also send a strong message of a commonality of intent that might really boost morale in a situation of great uncertainty for people. And the last point I wanted to make, it's also important to be aware of the limits of what can be done in remote or by limiting social distance. Earlier in the conversation, Anita was mentioning issues around mental health. I'm very concerned about that personally. Also as an educator, over my years as a teacher, as a professor, I've been seeing many students struggling with mental health from a young age. And it also applies to many workers, even more for those affected personally by the pandemics. And this is very hard to solve at a distance. I think I kind of enjoy teaching in the class, but then, I enjoy also teaching online. It wasn't that bad. I thought it would be worse. But helping a 20-year-old person with problems of anxiety, depression, and so on, but any kind of worker, again, from a screen, I have a hard time with. And so organizations in defining ways to social distancing people should be aware that not everything can be done from a distance.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've given us a good overview of the many dimensions of this, from mental health to the structure of your office. The office structure one's very interesting. One of the things that certainly I was hearing from companies as when the shift was, everybody shifted to remote, was that companies that had a more open office, particularly ones with more of a hoteling model where employees basically had everything in their briefcase and they just come into work and find a desk and work. For them, the pivot to online was relatively simple because everybody was used to having everything in their briefcase, and they were used to not printing anything and basically just pulling their laptop out wherever and settling down. But when you think about coming back to work, actually, that might work a bit in reverse. Having people sharing desks every day.
Yeah, who makes the first move? How often do we sanitize? I mean,
yeah. So something to think about. I'm getting all sorts of great questions here, so I'm gonna start diving into the questions. And one that a lot of people are asking is, what if our neighboring country in Canada decides to get back to work before we do? Certainly, President Trump has made no secret of the fact that he's very anxious to reopen the U.S. economy. Is that going to put us at a serious competitive disadvantage? How do we, many of our companies in Canada will be operating on both sides of the border. How do we deal with that? Who wants to go first?
So, this is a complicated question, but let me just offer a couple of thoughts in case they're helpful. I also was just looking at the Q&A and saw that people want practical suggestions. So forgive me for being, so putting on my hat as a global health scholar here for a moment, but just let me say a couple of things about what I think is going to happen. I think the restrictions on reopening will be lifted first when we can do rigorous testing, which employers may be required or asked to administer, and then contact tracing, so that if, for example, Nico and I work together and I were to be ill, he would be notified that he has been exposed. And there's a lot of interesting ways to do that are being explored. There's a group at Harvard and MIT that are looking at putting tokens in our phones so that we would own that data and the government wouldn't be able to surveil that and so on. But the basic principle here of repeated testing, perhaps even daily testing, and contact tracing to notify people who have been exposed is going to be at the core of the reopening. Now, you would want to reopen, right, essential industries first, and industries where those kinds of systems could be implemented relatively readily. If I were running a company, I'm not sure I would want to be on the front of that reopening. I would race to the end of the line potentially, because I care about my people, I care about my customers, I don't want my employees to be exposed, I don't want that liability or responsibility. I'm not sure I would be good at implementing these kinds of procedures. And so it's not going to be, we've talked about the light switch, and President Trump, of course, as you noted, Tiff, is very eager to reopen, but I'm not sure that the response to the reopening is necessarily going to be as simple as allowing it. Right. So how do you create an appetite? I may have, as a company owner, as an owner of a company, I may have areas of activity that I've been concerned about in the past. And now we're going to lay on top of that uncertainty about consumer demand because of people making different decisions about their budgets. All of this is going to conspire to cause people to really think about, am I ready yet? Am I good? Do I want to be among the first? And the different strategies are going to be employed by different companies that are seeking to deal with this. And of course, it's going to vary tremendously across sectors. So you think about retail, there's a tremendous difference between, a large retail bank that can keep some branches open while others are closed and divert traffic to centralized branches where these kinds of test and trace procedures can be readily sort of made to make sense versus, a single location retailer that's seeking, how can I afford even to get started again? What am I going to be dealing with if I wait, right? So lots of very complicated problems that have to be addressed.
Nico, I'm going to go over to you, but just sort of as a follow-on, one of the questions that we're getting a lot is, and Anita gave us some of the answer, but perhaps you could fill in from your perspective. What are the key elements of a back to work plan? And as you think about fairness or equality, as you said, people will only withstand a certain degree of unfairness before they start to push back. What would be some of the key elements of a plan, and how do you deal with fairness, given that the impacts will depend a bit on what kind of work you do? There's no way around that.
So I completely agree with Anita that, as much as you want to open soon, you want to see if the companies want to actually open, and because of these reasons, because it's still very, very risky. You have to put in place an infrastructure. If you look at the guidelines by the WHO, also yesterday by the European Commission, for example, about sort of the steps to follow or the criteria to check for reopening, they're very strict. And testing and the ability to test comes number one. So definitely having a testing infrastructure, again, even within the company. So again, a role of regulator also in that sense by companies, almost as a public agent, is necessary to give a sense, that you care and that you're being transparent to your workers. You not only want the companies to go back and produce, but the workers to go to the companies and go back and produce. So there needs to be some sort of agreement, social contract between employers and employees that they're safe. And that it's true, different workers have different degrees of exposure completely, but this applies to everybody. I think in the perception of work, workers perceive the difference from each other less than a purely statistical analysis would imply. And so this applies to all workers. And again, testing, having a plan, and in mind for the reopening and sort of laying it out to the whole sort of staff and employees is extremely important. Again, the managing of expectation, the provision of information will go, in this case, a long way. And again, give a sense of, maybe sacrificing something in the name of fairness, to give a sense that even those who need still to stay home, even for their own sake, are taken care of. This will also increase and boost the morale of those who are allowed to go back to work and have a full salary and more career opportunities or earlier career opportunities and so on. So this cannot be undervalued. I don't think it's an abstract concept. It's really, in this situation, it's extremely concrete and practical, because people are highly, there is high uncertainty. People are afraid. I'm afraid. I don't know if I would go to my office at Rotman right now, to be honest, and it's pretty safe. I have my own office, but
not socially acceptable.
To begin with, but also scary in some ways. So, it's really crucial to give a sense of common purpose, even before having specific provisions, and showing that the plan is well thought out is crucial, because we need a huge amount of coordination here, workers with employers, different units of government, different countries. I think one of the big headache here is the cacophony of voices from different countries, whereas we need more coordination in terms of health, but also in terms of trade. But we're lacking it. So maybe companies, at least at the local level, might sort of supplement this role and act as coordinator of beliefs and views in a way that's consistent.
I want to get to a question, a very practical question I'm getting from many listeners, and that is childcare.
Childcare, right.
So how do we, if just think about the summer, let's say the restrictions start to lift. I don't know what'll be open and what'll be closed, but you could certainly imagine a lot of summer camps might be closed, or the sort of activities that your children might be signed up to for the summer while you're at work. And then getting to the fall, if the schools were not to reopen, that would be a further problem. For employers, again, you're going to have some employees with small kids that need a lot of your attention. Any advice to employers on how to think about this?
The conversation about childcare is not. It's related to the way that we're living together, and related to the vulnerabilities of the elderly and people who have the conditions that make them vulnerable to COVID and susceptible to COVID. So what you worry about is, the statistics seem to clearly state that children are not as vulnerable to having the most severe form of this disease, but they do carry. And we need to do, David Naylor was talking on a podcast that I just listened to this morning, some great points about this. The former president of our university and a physician, the former dean of the medical school, David Naylor, talking about how we need to really understand the transmission of this disease between children and adults much more deeply than we do right now, because our susceptibility as adults to the disease seems to be related to the virulence of the disease in the person from whom we contracted. So if, I had a grandchild, a 5-year-old grandchild who was living in my home who was infected but didn't have a very severe case, how likely am I as that grandparent to be infected? And how likely am I to get a severe infection? So we don't actually know the answer to that question yet. We have to invest in science and knowledge to actually be able to find out. You can envision that groups of children together with healthy teachers and healthy care workers and healthy summer camp counselors could be relatively safe based on what we already know. The worry is what happens to those young people when they go back into their families and expose others? Are they vectors of disease that could create these hotspots? And the answer is we really don't know. One thing we do know is that nursing homes are dangerous, and we have to be very careful. And I think it's raising these profound questions about, why are we, whether or not having elders live together in this kind of arrangement actually really makes sense in the long run. Nico mentioned already that the healthcare sector has to be rethought. What are we doing, by creating these environments where people are not thriving necessarily either?
You got to believe there's going to have to be a whole rethink of elder care. We've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to start with you, Nico. Give you a couple of minutes. And then come back to Anita. There's a whole lot of questions about longer term thinking. What could be some of the more permanent consequences of this? Is this going to is this going to accelerate the race towards virtual and the sort of the virtual real world interaction? As we think longer term, what are some of the longer term consequences you think?
Well, definitely for, I think, the long term, there will be a change in behavior. We've been talking about it, will be stay more home and maybe go less to the restaurant and so on. And many activities, we were mentioning entertainment, sport, music, and so on. That's where I think the interaction with the virtual might actually take off. I mean, virtual reality has never really fully taken off. We've been talking about it for a long time. But you can think about, listen to a concert with, in 3D or with some augmented reality and things like that. So definitely there will be much, much more interaction between the virtual and the real, and hopefully not to the extent that we miss the personal connections for certain things. That is very important. This is a temptation at that point to stay home. We also might have an issue related to that with physical health, and not just COVID or diseases like this, but exercising, keeping in good shape, and so on. Which we have the tendency, if we are also asked to stay home, not to do these things, not to go to the gym or not to go for a run. So we need to rethink also a way, probably, in which in terms of public health, we make sure that people eat healthy and exercise and so on, including kids, obviously. So there will be, I can see a large change in behavior. And a good question that Anita has raised a couple of times is whether there will be a change in cultural change in what we believe is important for us, what are the values that are really important in a society. I don't have an answer to that. I don't know if anybody does, but definitely there is room for it. There is room for it. We have time to think about it these days, but it's hard to have a sense of how profound this will be or to what extent people will want to forget.
Okay, let's go to, we're a little short of time here. Anita, I want to give you a chance to get in the final word. Longer term.
I couldn't agree with Nico more. And we already know that the next generation, the students in our classrooms, their generation values some things that my generation didn't value, and things that we thought we took for granted are no longer being taken for granted. And I agree. I think there's some contours of where we're going around. I mentioned the SDGs, things like remediating inequality and thinking about the climate and thinking about frivolous spending of money and making sure that our consumption is meaningful and things like that. But more than anything, I think it's interpersonal relationships and friendships and trust and quality of our interactions that people are going to value, more than ever after this is over, and figuring out how to support that and actualize that kind of compassion and desire and appetite to be together is going to be the big challenge, at least for the next year or two. Tiff, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I think that is a very good note to end on. And so Anita and Nico, I think you've both given all of us a lot to think about as to how do we approach reopening the economy? How do we do it in a way that values our employees, that keeps them safe, that serves our customers, that is sensitive to different different people's needs and recognizes that there will be, unequal consequences, and how do we address those? So thank you to you both. It's been a marvelous discussion and conversation. As we wrap up, I want to remind everybody that this is a weekly webinar series. If you missed the two previous ones, the first one was on building resilience. The second one was leading remote teams. And there's both a short summary and a link to those presentations and discussions as well on our website. So to all of you, thank you for joining us. We will be back next week, and next week's topic, we started to get into it today, but there's a lot more to be said. It will focus on innovation readiness during and after the COVID-19 crisis. So thank you all for joining us. I encourage you to bring a friend, come back next week, bring a friend, but make sure you do it virtually, and stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks very much.
Thank you.